Hi guys, I'm Latimer here. I'm just going to talk to you guys a little bit today about line choices. It's a pretty controversial subject here. There's a lot of, everything that I'll say will probably be kind of subject to opinion, but I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my line preferences. If you pick the right lines with the right baits, the right rod, your day on the water is going to be a lot better. It's going to go a lot smoother. There's basically 3 different types of lines that I want to talk about, and I think they pretty much cover everything that you'll have to deal with when you're out there fishing as well. There's mono. That's pretty much it's been a staple for years now. Guys have been using mono since, I know, at least the 80s. I was born in '82, so I know it's been used since the 80s. Fluorocarbon came along in the late 90s, early 2000s, and it's pretty much taken over. Fluorocarbon is a very widely used line now. And we're going to talk about braided lines. So I'm going to walk you through the reasons I use each line and the different applications that I use those different types of line. So pretty much for the most part, fluorocarbon sinks. It's going to be one major difference. Mono, for the most part, floats or is the most buoyant. Okay, and braid also floats or is more buoyant than fluorocarbon. And I use that term floats very loosely. A lot of you guys that are new to bass fishing, new to bait casting equipment, I'm going to tell you that mono is going to be a much more friendly line to use. If you'll use 12, 15 pound test mono, that line is going to be a lot softer. It's going to be a lot more pliable. It doesn't coil as much on your reel. Fluorocarbon has a tendency to want to jump off your reel. It's very coily. It's a harder material. So that makes the material a lot more difficult to use. Okay, so if you guys out there that are just getting into bass fishing, just starting, and you're not really that astute with a bait caster, lose some pride, get you some mono. It'll work just fine. Some of the disadvantages of mono are as follows. You guys have probably heard this before. Mono has a lot more stretch in it, okay? It's a lot softer material, so it's going to have a lot more stretch in it than fluorocarbon does. So, you know, on a long cast, sometimes it can be hard to get the hook penetration with mono. But that stretch in mono also, in my mind, makes it good for baits with treble hooks. So, you know, a lot of times, and this is kind of taboo. Nobody wants to say this. No fisherman says this, but I actually kind of prefer to throw my crankbaits on mono. Everybody says, well, mono floats, so your crankbait's not going to get the same depth, yada, yada, yada. Yeah. But if I'm throwing a shallow crankbait and I'm just making those short 15, 20, 25, 30-foot casts, I don't feel like having a line that is less buoyant and that sinks is that big a factor in the depth of my crankbait. I like being able to hook up. That little bit of delay that's caused by the stretch in that line, I feel like I get a little better hookup. If a fish makes a long run with that mono, that line will give, and that just gives me a little extra leverage on that fish when I use mono. So, you know, I use mono probably a lot more than a lot of anglers will. So, you know, like on my rattle traps and things like that, I'll use mono. It's so much easier. It comes off my reel very smoothly. You know, it doesn't coil up nearly as bad, so it just comes off really quick. I can make casts. It's very cheap. If I throw out there, get a bird's nest, throw it off, I can re-spool my reel and be just fine. Now, one of the other disadvantages of mono line is it does absorb water, so it will not last as long as fluorocarbon. Fluorocarbon will last a very long time. As long as you don't get a bird's nest and get too many kinks in it, it's going to be just fine. It's going to do very well. But mono, it does break down with the sun, just laying on the deck of your boat when it's really hot. That line is going to start to break down, it absorbs the water, so that makes the line break down as well. So, you know, those are some disadvantages. You can weigh in and out. Mono is so cheap that I use it very often for a lot of different things. If I'm flipping and pitching in a very short cast, you know, very short, where it's going to be high impact, I'll use mono. I'll use, you know, 20-pound test mono to absorb some of that impact when I set the hook. You know, there's nothing worse than going to rear back on one, set the hook, and you jerk slacking in the line and you lose the fish. So that mono absorbs some of that impact, and I feel like sometimes, not all the time, sometimes it helps me convert to fish catches. Now let's talk about fluorocarbon. You know, fluorocarbon is pretty much the most widely used line out there right now. Everybody uses fluorocarbon. There's plenty of different good choices for you out there when you're using fluorocarbon. It's a great line to use. Fluorocarbon is a much more dense product. It doesn't refract light as much, so you're going to hear people are going to tell you that fluorocarbon is virtually invisible. What they're talking about, because what you're going to do, you're going to put your line down in the water and you can see, I can clearly see my line. Well, what they're talking about is the light refraction. I'm sure you guys have done the project in school that when you put your pencil in a little clear jar of water, that you can see the pencil looks like it's off to the side about 1/8 inch. That's the light refraction. The water actually refracts the light and it makes the pencil looks like it's to the side. Well, the same thing happens with your line. Fluorocarbon doesn't reflect the light like mono does. Fluorocarbon is a great line. It's very dense. It's a little bit stiffer line than mono. So in my mind, some people are going to tell you different. For me, it's a little bit more difficult to work with on a bait caster. If I'm throwing very, very small baits, number 5 shad wraps, weightless, like a Z-Man jerk shad, something weightless, I do not want to use fluorocarbon on my bait caster if I can get away with it. That line is going to coil up. It just doesn't cast as easy as mono does with very small light lures. Mono just comes off the reel a lot more fluently in my mind. So I'm going to use a softer material. Now, if I'm throwing a heavy 1/2 ounce rattle trap, a 10XD, a 6XD, big baits, big crankbaits, if I'm throwing a 3/8 ounce swing head on a big 1/2 ounce worm, if I'm tying off a top shot for my wacky rig, 100% of the time I'm using fluorocarbon for those applications. But if I'm throwing very, very small baits that don't weigh a lot, that's when I'll use mono, because I feel like it comes off the line, it comes off the reel a lot more fluently, since it doesn't have as many coils, not as coily. There's less resistance on the line eyes as it's exiting the rod, and I don't get as many backlashes. But fluorocarbon is great. By far less stretch. You're not going to have as much stretch in your line. It refracts the light, so it's going to be a lot more invisible than the mono will be. And you're going to have a better hook set because of that lower stretch in it. So lasts a long time, will not break down to sun, water, practically impermeable. It's a totally different resin, so it's going to act and feel much more different on your rod. Once you put the two, when you compare the two on one rod, on 2 different rods, you're definitely going to notice the difference between fluorocarbon and mono. Talking about braided lines, so braid, of course, is the most buoyant of all the 3 lines, and I use it a lot. You have to use it when you're fishing around vegetation. I say have to, but most of the time when you're fishing around vegetation, you're going to use braided line. That braid just really rips through vegetation very well. It's also a great line to use when you're using frogs. When hookups are really important, I use it almost exclusively on my spinning reels now. Just about every spinning reel I have is spooled up with straight braided line, 8-10 pound test braided line, and I'll tie a top shot with an Alberto knot of fluorocarbon, anywhere from 6 to 10 pound test. So that's what I use exclusively just about on my spinning reels. The only exception to using just straight up fluorocarbon or mono on my spinning reels, if it's very windy. Braid is a very light material, and windy conditions, like if I'm trying to keep a drop shot on or shaky head on the bottom, it can be difficult in a very windy condition to keep that bait on the bottom, because this line is so light, and you'll get a bigger bow in your line. But the braid is so sensitive, it's really hard. It has to be really windy before I make that decision. Braid is so sensitive, there's no stretch. I've had the same braid on all year, guys. I fished a tour. I fished probably somewhere around 200 days a year. I had the same braid on. You spool up on your spinning reels with braid, you're probably not going to have to replace it just about ever. So, it lasts a long time. If you get some good braid, get a good high quality Very fine line. Don't get a coarse braid that you can hear going through your guys. If you can hear it going through your eyes when you got a fish on, you've got cheap braid, it's not very good. Get a nice smooth 8-strand braid, and you're going to be satisfied with the results you get with your spinning reel. You'll be able to cast farther with this. Braided line is very, very soft. Does not have any memory at all, so there's less resistance going through the eyes of the rod, so it exits very quickly, which is good. That gives you really good cast. You don't have to put a lot of effort in your hook sets. With the spinning reel, I really don't even set the hook. I do a more pulling and reeling with this line because there's no stretch, so there's no need to really put the hammer on it. But it's just really good line to use on your spinning reels. I use it a lot when we're punching. When you're using a big weight, ounce and a half, 2 ounce weight, punching vegetation, frogs, top waters, anything. The only thing that I really don't like to use braided line on is treble hooks. It doesn't have any stretch in it, and a lot of times with the treble hook you'll have a fish just hooked in the gill, the side, the face, barely in the lip, and having something that doesn't have a stretch is usually a bad idea. So that's the only exception to the rule. I typically don't like to tie a top shot on bait casters, only because that little bit of a knot coming through the tip of the guide, that creates a little resistance, so when you go to cast you'll get a little bit more backlashes. But I do use it. If you watch the trip to Venice on my YouTube channel, you'll see I explained there I was using like 45-pound test braid with a 25-pound test tippet, and it worked great. That works good with heavy baits, but if you're throwing a light bait, 1/2 ounce, 1/4 ounce bait on a bait caster, and you've got a top shot, you're going to run into some issues with the knot coming out of your guides. It just doesn't come out very fluently. But with your spinning reels, it's a good idea to use braid with the fluorocarbon tippet. It just makes life a lot easier. You're not going to have to re-spool very often. You'll get less line twist, or almost no line twist at all, and it's going to last a long time. So when you're looking at lines, consider those things. Consider what you're using, the size of the bait, the weight of the baits, and the application that you're going to fish when you're using your lines, and you're going to be a lot happier. You're not going to have as many backlashes. You're going to be able to cast farther and control the baits a lot better if you use the right lines.